Be sure to check out part 1 of this installment of the After the Collapse series, where I discuss different sociological concepts with respect to the definition of gangs and how and why they develop in contemporary society and in the aftermath of societal collapse. In this part of the series, we're going to talk about the general types and categories of gangs that are going to arise in these hypothetical conditions and some of the barriers that they're going to face in sustaining themselves. Please show your support for the After the Collapse series by liking, commenting, and sharing this video on other social media platforms. Enjoy the video. Now, there's going to be many different types of gangs and groupings of people that arise after a long-term SHTF situation. And for the sake of simplicity and commonality of my YouTube audience, of which 85% come from the United States, most of the demographics and the examples that I'm going to be using in this video series are drawn from that population. Now, the first type of gangs are prison gangs, and most prison gangs actually run street gangs. So in the US, they number up to 150,000, and they comprise about 15% of all the gang members in the United States. Now, there's been some speculation in the survival community that prisoners will be left to die in SHTF. But they forget about the fact that these 150,000 prisoners, who all tend to be towards the upper ranks and the higher leadership of these gangs, have at their disposal hundreds of thousands of street soldiers who will likely attempt to bust them out if and when the prison guards go AWOL when society collapses. Now, the extent of gang planning for SHTF or WROL situations, only individual gangs are probably ever going to disavow their plans for SHTF. But I would assume that due to the high level of corruption in a lot of these prisons, which in many cases is driven by bribery and blackmail, that a lot of these prisoners may find a way out if the shit ever really did hit the fan. Now, street gangs are probably the most common gang member in society. They comprise the bulk of the 1 million gang members in the United States, and while they're often underestimated for their lack of organization, they still do have the most manpower, and they do have an increasingly larger fiscal capability. Now, another type of gangs are motorcycle gangs. Now, motorcycle gangs are usually better organized and have more control over their members. They tend to have more codes and creeds and allegiances than do many street gangs. Motorcycle gangs tend to be a bit more regimented in everything they do. Now, the membership of these motorcycle gangs is substantially lower than the street gangs of the United States of America. One consideration for motorcycle gangs in a shit hits the fan situation is that inevitably gasoline is going to run out, so the motoric aspect of these groups will cease. So the notion that they're going to go from town to town plundering may hold sway for a short time, but ultimately they're going to run out of gas. Another group which may be a force to be reckoned with, and that I talked about in my recent After the Collapse installment of martial law, are rogue militia or military. Now, there's approximately 2 million standing army and militia in the United States, and indeed, if the shit hits the fan, a lot of them are going to be jumping ship and will certainly be forces to be reckoned with. It should also be noted that there's a significant gang presence in the US military. Members of most of the major gangs in the United States can be found in all branches of the US military. Street gangs such as the Crips, the Latin Kings, MS-13, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Hells Angels all have been found to have a significant presence there. It's been estimated that a whopping 1% of the US military has or have been affiliated with criminal organizations. However, the reasons for entering the military may be varied. Some may enter as a way to try to get out of the life of crime, whereas others join the military with the intention of gaining the strategic and tactical skills that they'll learn there, and then employing those skills for criminal purposes upon their return. In the same way, rogue police may also be a threat. There's approximately 1 million, and I think that there's probably another 1 million privatized security personnel who are employed in the United States. And these groups have the means, the training, and the arsenal to become highly influential in a post-collapse environment if they decide to maintain their ranks in the absence of rule of law and form their own self-serving group. Now the next group is preppers. So there's an estimated 3 to 10 million survivalists in the United States with various size groups. Lots of these are isolated from one another, except for the ones that form prepping groups pre-collapse. The problem with prepping groups is the proximity factor. When only 1 to 3% of the population are preppers, finding ones that you can effectively work with in a close enough proximity to you is going to be very challenging, if not impossible, and just wouldn't make logistic sense. And very few preppers are going to uproot all their gear and move to somebody else's house for protection and shit hits the fan, especially if it's someone you only know because they're another prepper. Now, most preppers would argue that their preparedness efforts are an attempt to avoid being forced into a mob or gang when resources become scarce. But it should be noted that this does not necessarily immunize preppers from becoming post-apocalyptic gangbangers. Now there's also the more distinguished organized criminals, and these would be the various mafias, which indeed may have more clout. It's unknown, however, how prepared these groups are to endure societal collapse. They tend to deal more with the sophisticated white-collar or grid-dependent crimes than being right down there in the nitty-gritty like a lot of these street gangs. So they may not have that raw exposure to the hustle like street gangs have, but many of the connections they have probably permeate well into corrupt government agencies, and this might give them a significant advantage in an SHTF situation. Now the type of groups I'm talking about are ones like the Italian mob, the Japanese Yakuza, the Russian mob, the Armenian mob, the Mexican mafia, the triads, etc. These are all going to be forces to potentially be reckoned with in a shit hits the fan situation. Now there are other potential groupings of people that can be as hazardous but won't give themselves the label of gangs. These are going to be groups that would form after the deconstruction of society. Now, the first are a phenol-based groups, so basically groups that are tied together by family lines. In a shift situation, of course, they're still going to be limited in terms of geography. So if your family members are scattered all throughout the city or the county, it's going to be hard for you to consolidate your group into one unit when all the communication systems are down and the transportation is compromised. And the same goes for any group that is not knit along geographical lines. Now there's also religious groups, and millions of Americans are going to be susceptible to the clutches of fundamentalist religious ideology, and many are going to blindly follow anybody who's preaching on a street corner after the collapse. Now while this might prevent people from straying too far from their morals or ethics, this can, as it's been used throughout history, be used to manipulate people. You're going to have many different denominations who are going to have different ideas of how society should be run, and these groups are going to run into conflict with one another, whether it's Protestants or Catholics or Sunnis or Shiites. Sectarian violence will just be a fact of post-apocalyptic life. Community groups and proximity groupings, I think, are going to be the most common type of group or gang. Now, most people are going to be aligned along the lines of, neighborhoods, subdivisions, hamlets, suburbs, gated communities, various townships, counties. The fact is, ultimately, your neighbors may be the first in your post-apocalyptic posse. Now, last but not least are going to be child gangs. Now, children who are orphaned by disaster may coalesce into their own groupings as they've done in the past. Unfortunately, many of these children are going to be exploited by gang leaders because children are very susceptible and moldable and can be easily manipulated. Now we need to talk about gang size and territoriality, because this is something which is often feared by many preppers and survivalists, that there's going to be a gang of overwhelming size that's going to overthrow them. Now, in our current modernized world, gangs could double or triple their membership overnight if they wanted to. Most, however, particularly motorcycle gangs, they're going to want to restrict their numbers in order to have greater control over their members. Now, remember that larger gangs mean greater liabilities and a greater amount of risk. especially if you're the control freak leader at the top. You don't want too many people who are going to be able to give up secrets about you, or perhaps even attempt to overthrow you themselves. Greater numbers in gangs simply mean more potential for defectors, spies, moles, and traitors. Now, on the other hand, gang size is going to be limited by the carrying capacity of the land. That is, by how much there is to scavenge, plunder, or extort. The scarcity of resources is going to be a big factor in determining how big a gang can get. So a combination of how many resources are available and how cohesive that gang is, how strong its shared value system is going to determine how big the gang can inevitably get. Once you get to a certain point in gang size, there has to be some pretty deeply ingrained beliefs that everybody shares in order to keep that group unified. Now, there was an anthropologist named Robin Dunbar who has a concept called Dunbar's number. And Dunbar proposed that based on the human brain size, human beings can only comfortably maintain 150 relationships at any given time. So this might limit a small tribe or a gang to 250 in size maximum. Now, this is the number at which humans can effectually function and self-regulate without the need for some overarching governing body. Once group size exceeds the threshold of 250 people, more complex social organization is going to be required, and that's going to require more laws, forms of government, shared belief systems, things that, quite frankly, a lot of gangs are not going to be capable of. So I think, generally speaking, larger gangs are not going to be as prevalent as some people think, since it would be too hard to sustain those size of legions in a grid down situation. Now, something which is also going to limit the size of gangs is a simple fact that, if the shit were to hit the fan, if the bombs started falling, if birds started falling from the air and people started dropping like flies, a lot of gangs are going to be separated unless they have pre-established rendezvous points and they have these contingency plans to manage. If they don't, they're going to find it very difficult to organize without modern communication methods. So if the communication grid is down and you have your boys in different parts of the city and they all have their families to worry about too, and likely will be going AWOL in the same way that lots of military and rogue police will be going AWOL, it's going to be very hard to network at that point and concentrate all your troops towards one end, unless you have a really good off-grid comm system. Now, in the long term, of course, as different communication mechanisms are devised, then you're going to see larger and larger groupings of gangs potentially. And one advantage that gangs do have is that they already use a lot of cryptic means of communicating their territoriality. So they use things like graffiti. This is going to be something which is not going to change after the collapse. They will continue to communicate in secret in this way. Now, gangs are going to have to function very efficiently if they're going to maintain a caloric maintenance. So it's going to take a lot of energy and resources to nomadically loot and pillage, even if it's done systematically. Now, over-plundering can easily lead to the self-destruction of a gang, because gangs, like all predators, must balance the energy expended against the energy replenished when choosing their prey. If they only loot and pillage, then they're quickly going to burn themselves out. Now, a gang can only plunder if it's nomadic and if it's conscriptive. That is, it must be constantly mobile and it must be constantly acquiring new members. If it was a sedentary group, then they would likely use up all of the easy prey within the immediate vicinity, and this is going to force them to venture further and further out from their home base in order to acquire the resources that they need in order to survive. And this mode of operation is simply unsustainable, because ultimately they're going to be expending more resources to venture further and further out for harder and harder targets, and it's going to eventually weaken them and they're going to destroy themselves. Therefore, any intelligent gang is going to see the value in extorting through constant tyranny and taxation. Taxation is basically exploiting the fruits of one's labor, and a classic example of this is in the show The Walking Dead in season 7, where Negan is now at the helm of this post-apocalyptic world order, and the way that he's been able to achieve it is through taxation. Plunderers burn themselves out. It's the conquerors who have the foresight to see the benefit and not just plundering people, killing them, raping them, and taking everything they have, basically like a scorched earth policy. Rather, how can I use them on a constant basis? You're going to get far more from a person who you can extort for many years on end than you would by simply looting their pantry once. Now, a quote from Negan best summarizes this viewpoint when he says simply that, "I don't want a garden." And this is very significant because you must realize that most gang members don't have the skill sets in order to survive off-grid in a post-collapse situation. And as such, the only skill set they do have, which is strong-arming people to do what they want, that's going to be the only thing they bring to the table and the only thing they have to utilize. So it only makes sense that they're going to try to tax people who can live off the land so that they can parasitically leech off of their efforts. Now, gangs that do try to survive by plunder, and even the ones who try to extort the labor of others, are going to be diminished by the attritional effect of constantly fighting and warring for resources. So they're constantly going to need reinforcements to replenish their ranks, and this is going to require new gang initiates. But due to the dictatorial nature of the gang leaders, they're going to probably want to properly vet these members, and they're always going to be suspicious of people they allow into the gang as they are today. And this, of course, is going to lead to some heavy-handedness and infighting within the group, in that many gang leaders who may get suspicious might routinely fleece their ranks and get rid of some of their own members, which is going to require replacements. Now, conversely, if a balance of tyranny and benevolence is not achieved, it's likely that these gangs are going to be preoccupied with infighting, and if they are, they're going to be overrun by rival groups. So some type of social cohesion, whether it's a belief system, has to be in place in order to unify people, especially with gangs in larger numbers. And a gang is only going to be as strong as the bond that unites it. Prospective post-collapse gang members will have to prove their allegiance to the gang by doing some dirty work. People may be forced to do things in order to ensure protection for their families or to prove their allegiance to the gang. This will be especially apparent in WROL, where people have no choice but to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do in order to protect their families. Many tyrants will use the threat of familial punishment against them. Now, pre-collapse gang initiation can involve anything from theft, violence, rape, or murder. In the same way that gangs have initiation rituals, pre-collapse, it's likely these things are going to carry over into the post-collapse, and in the absence of rule of law, of course, these initiation and hazing missions are going to be far more intense. Now, because gangs are going to be also warring with rival gangs, this is going to drastically reduce their numbers and their ability to effectively extort resources from the passive population. It's likely that in the crossfire of all of this gang violence is going to be passive people who are just trying to get by and sustain themselves. Now, not everybody is going to be a prime person for gang recruitment. Gang members probably will continue to exploit drug addicts as they do now. Drugs will still be a commodity in a post-collapse era so long as they can get their hands on them, because they are a highly effective tool at controlling people and getting them to do things for you. Gangs are going to prefer people who are young as they're easier to manipulate. Think about child soldiers, for example. Orphan children will be conscripted quite easily, and of course they're going to be susceptible to all kinds of brainwashing, and they're going to be molded into these sociopathic henchmen who are going to be capable of committing any atrocity that the gang wants. The gang, of course, is going to provide a lot of these children that sense of family and belonging that they no longer have from their families, in the same way that gangs exploit this phenomena right now. Now, lone wolves are going to be another target. Those that aren't stricken with that whole last man on earth syndrome will also be high on the list of potential initiates. Due to their lack of family and social obligations, and perhaps they have less dogs in the fight, they may not have the scruples to stave off the promise of all the loot and booty that's promised by gang membership. So if you plan on going lone wolf, my suggestion is to make sure that your moral compass is fixed in the right direction. The reality is, gangs don't want strong-minded people who have lots of family ties, who can try to convince that person otherwise, who might have other ambitions. Maybe they're part of other established groups. That's going to diminish their allegiance to the gang. What you want are people with very malleable minds who are going to do what you want without question. A great historical example of how gangs come to fill the power vacuum in the absence of rule of law was New York City in the early 1800s, when you had the 5 Points. It was a section of New York City which was very downtrodden. This area was the setting for the film Gangs of New York, and it was a melting pot for all sorts of people: European immigrants, draft dodgers, freed slaves, Native Americans. It's a great historical example of what might happen in a poverty-stricken, densely populated region in which law and order cannot be upheld. Now, many historians have described the 5 Points as a disease-infested slum ridden with debauchery. Listen to this description of the 5 Points. Only certain areas of London's East End vied with it in the Western world for sheer population density, disease, infant and child mortality, unemployment, prostitution, violent crime, and other classic ills of the urban destitute. The unpaved streets were often buried in a foot of mud mixed with human and animal excrement, and mosquitoes bred in stagnant pools created by poor drainage. It certainly was a living hell. As a consequence of these conditions, gangs came to rule the roost, the most notorious of which was William Poole, the leader of the Bowery Boys gang, also known as Bill the Butcher. Now, in response to the tyranny of Bill the Butcher and the Bowery Boys, the Irish immigrants took up arms against them in order to protect their vote in an election. So this is just another example of how gangs are not only used to antagonize, but are also used as a means of defense and as a way to regulate and diminish tyranny. The 5 Points were a great example of how, in the absence of rule of law, society is going to organize and police itself however inefficiently it may be. Even the essentially privatized local fire and police department precincts fought with one another for the right to work certain territories of the city. So this is proof positive that conflict between tribes is a way that people try to self-regulate and govern themselves. Now, in the same way, many gangs emerged as a means of self-defense in the Wild West. Posses emerge in response to these outlaws and bandits, and it's this kind of tribalism that tends to lead to an arrested development, which is why the West could not get beyond itself until the United States government brought some structure to the region and increased its presence there. In the next part of this installment of the After the Collapse series, we're going to explore how specifically gang behavior is going to unfold city by city in the United States. Hopefully people in Canada and abroad will be able to extrapolate the conclusions in part 3 to their own countries. And in part 4, we're going to be looking at the social dynamics of gangs and the psychology of gang members, so stay tuned. So once again, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and by all means share this video on other social media platforms. Canadian Prepper out.